Well, Richard is one of the more controversial English monarchs and a notable case of a historical figure who is, to a large extent, to an unhelpful extent, understood through a brief period in his life, through the 18 months at the end of his life. It's one of the great weaknesses of historical discussion of Richard that most of the discussion of him, his career, has concentrated on the events following the death of his brother King Edward IV in April 1483, Richard's own seizure of the throne, his reign, his death. And this has had a highly distorting effect on understanding of the man himself. The rest of his career is seen, as it were, through the wrong end of a telescope, through the distorting lens of the violent controversies which have attended, which have raged around those events at the end of his life. And he has, of course, been controversial ever since his own time, because it was in the interest of the succeeding Tudors to blacken his name, and a tradition of historical writing which specifically demonised him then famously culminated in Shakespeare's celebrated play, of course.
The only thing I knew about Richard was kind of, the Shakespearean thing going on in the background, and that's who I thought this man was. So when I read Paul Murray Kendall's book, I absolutely had to find out more about this man. I needed to know who was the real Richard III. And as I researched him, what I found absolutely fascinated, because as a screenwriter, our meat and potatoes is finding the most incredible characters, the most complex people who do amazing things. And Richard just fitted that in a complete nutshell.
This is Leicester. This is Leicester in 2005. What we have here is the city. This is a road called Vaughan Way, which runs around the city. And the reason this is a 2005 image is that what we have here is a site that has been subsequently developed to provide something called The Curve, which is a new cinema and theatre complex, a large John Lewis shopping centre. And if we look at how that translates to medieval Leicester, we can see the line of the medieval town outlined here in red. Now, all projects which involve building on a large scale these days require an archaeological survey before the ground can be dug up. And so large parts of this area have been surveyed in the past by the team from the University of Leicester Archaeological Services. And all of the areas in red have been previously surveyed. What has been less surveyed is this area in the top left here, outlined in yellow, and that's where the site of the Greyfriars Church is.
Some Ricardians had said, look, go to Leicester, there's lots of interesting things for you to see. Richard did visit the town, and obviously he was there before he left for Bosworth. So I went to Leicester, and they told me to go to this car park called the New Street Car Park, because they said there's a piece of medieval wall in an existing wall there, and they thought it might be part of this Franciscan friary where we believe that Richard was buried in 1485, called the Greyfriars.
So he went to the Battle of Bosworth. He would have been easily identifiable on the battlefield by the crown that he wore on top of his armour. He would have worn plate armour over chainmail, would have weighed somewhere between 23 and 25 kilograms in total, which is about half, again, of the weight that a modern soldier will carry in their body-worn armour. So he would have been mobile, he would have been able to move very well on the battlefield, but he would have been protected whilst he was wearing this armour from injuries to his body.
I don't know if you can make out, there's a church here, then a road, then a church. Now what this is this church here is St. Martin's Church, which is now Leicester Cathedral. This church here was the Greyfriars Church, where Richard was buried. So what I could see was church, road, church, which meant Leicester Cathedral, road, north side of the social services car park. I was absolutely ecstatic. I thought, right, it's time to search for Richard's grave.
And we know that the Battle of Bosworth was a very quick battle. It was all over in 2 hours, and unfortunately Richard died. Which brings us on to the search for Richard, and I know Philippa showed some maps of Leicester. This is the old map here of Leicester, and this is the site of Greyfriars that you saw at higher magnification in Philippa's talk. And if we look at that in more detail, we've got Friar Lane here, the garden that Philippa has talked about of Thomas Herrick, and Tank Street here. And if you look at the Modern Ordnance Survey map of Leicester, you can see again we have Friar Lane here. The blue parts on this map are buildings that have been developed. So if you look at this map and we superimpose it onto the medieval map, what you can see is that the majority of this site is covered in buildings. So we're left with the site of the car park here, and that's the area in which the investigation was to take place.
So, on the 25th of August 2012, which was the anniversary of the internment of King Richard in the Greyfriars in Leicester in 1485, we cut the ground. And this is the northern side of the Social Services car park where Trench 1 was positioned. And on that very same day, we found lower leg bones.
And here's the skeleton, more fully excavated. So you can see his head, you can see the bottom here. You can see his feet are missing, and you can see his head at this end is higher than you would expect. There's no evidence here of a coffin. So well, you might say, well, the wood would rot away, but if the wood had rotted away, then you would have expected to have seen nails, and there was no evidence of nails in the bottom of the trench. There was no evidence of any shrouding on Richard. So what that makes you think is that possibly he was buried quite quickly and the grave itself was too short. So if he was put in feet first, his head would not have had the space to be properly laid out. And you can see his hands are crossed, and possibly his hands were tied as he was put into the grave. But what's quite clear even at this stage is the pronounced curvature of the spine. And this again is that curvature of the spine in greater detail, and you can see the hands crossed.